Sveiki, aš esu Marija Vitkauskienė, gydytoja chirurgė. Šiandien esu pakviesta į šią įdomią ir labai naudingą konferenciją. Moderuosiu ją ir tikiuosi labai daug ką išsinešim, pasimokysim. Tai sveiki. Pirma mūsų pašnekovė ir pranešėja bus profesorė daktarė Stabell Benn, Pietinės Danijos universiteto profesorė. Labai malonu, kad jinai taip labai iš toli sutiko su mumis bendrauti, tai yra iš Afrikos. Tai tokia vasariška nuotaika mums visiems sušalusiem ir labai laukiantiem vasaros šilumos ir saulutės. Taigi jos tema bus, ko nepasimokėme iš pandemijos, bet dar nevėlu.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to join you at this conference. I'm currently in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, and I guess you can hear that in the background. There is some lively music. There are no windows in the rooms here, only nets, so I cannot turn off the music, unfortunately, but I hope you can hear me and hear what I would like to share with you in this presentation. And these are some of my thoughts on what we have not yet seemed to learn from the pandemic, but might not be too late. So would you please give me the next slide? A bit of a disclaimer here first. I'm a medical doctor and a doctor of medical science and an epidemiologist, and I'm also the mother of 2 kids who received all the vaccines in the Danish vaccination program. And you will know later in my presentation why I do feel that that is important to state up front. I've also spent part of the last 28 years here in Africa studying the overall health effects of vaccines, and that makes me a co-developer of this concept of non-specific effects of vaccines that I'll be talking about. And clearly I'm biased in their regard. I think they are very important, but apart from that, I don't have any other conflicts of interest. So next slide, please. According to the current understanding of vaccines, they are a biological preparation that improves immunity to the vaccine disease, and that understanding guides how we evaluate and monitor vaccines, because that's done based on their effect on the vaccine disease and also the assessment of potential well-known side effects. But unknown to most people, none of the currently used vaccines were actually tested for their effect on overall health before they were being introduced. It was assumed that they would only affect the vaccine disease, so nobody investigated whether they could affect the immune system and the immune system's ability to handle other infections afterwards. The assumption was simply that the immune system wouldn't learn anything from meeting the vaccine that it could use in the context of other pathogens. So, in fact, the effect on overall health, the question that most people ask themselves when they are vaccinated, namely, will I be healthier from taking this vaccine, is really not measured in clinical trials. It's just based on the extrapolation of the effects against the vaccine disease. So, for instance, if a measles vaccine is almost 100% efficacious and measles is 10% of all deaths, then it was assumed originally that the introduction of measles vaccine would reduce all-cause mortality by 10%. But in fact, this was never really investigated before we started looking into that. So the next slide, please. Our research here in Guinea-Bissau at the Benn Health Project, a field station that covers more than 200,000 people with regular home visits, has provided an opportunity to study the effect of vaccines on overall mortality and morbidity. And again, I remind you, this had not been done before. We started doing it in a systematic way in this context. So the next slide, please. So what we saw when we started looking at the effect of vaccines on overall health was that sometimes we saw effects of the vaccines that couldn't at all be explained based on the protection against the vaccine disease. So for instance, for measles vaccine, it was only anticipated that the introduction of measles vaccine would reduce all-cause mortality by 10%, because measles was only like 10% of all deaths. But in fact, what was seen was that the introduction of measles vaccine reduced overall mortality by more than 50%, so much more than could be ascribed to the prevention of measles infection. And this finding was repeated in many other settings. And in contrast, there were other vaccines that affected severe diseases like diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, but didn't have the expected effect on overall mortality. And in fact, we saw that mortality could sometimes increase even though these vaccines protected against deadly diseases. So that led us to propose the hypothesis that vaccines, in addition to their protective effects against the vaccine disease, also have what we have called non-specific effects. So if you take the next slide. Really, our hypothesis, our proposal here is that vaccines have non-specific effects on other diseases. They affect the risk of other infections, and we cannot know the full effect on overall health unless we estimate both the effect against the vaccine disease, but also the non-specific effects. The next slide here is a brief summary of the findings that we have done so far. So we have studied a total of 4 live vaccines: the measles vaccine, the BCG vaccine against tuberculosis, the smallpox vaccine, and the oral polio vaccine. And all these live vaccines, which contains the disease in an attenuated form, have beneficial non-specific effects. So they train the immune system and they reduce overall mortality much more than expected, based on the prevention of the vaccine disease. But in contrast, we have seen for now 6 non-live vaccines that they don't have the same beneficial effects. And in fact, they have sometimes negative effects. So even though the vaccines protect against the disease they are targeting, they can increase mortality. And intriguingly, this is primarily seen for the girls. So some of these vaccines actually increase female overall mortality. Importantly, the most recent vaccine has the strongest non-specific effects. So that means that these effects can be abrogated. The non-live vaccines can have negative effects, but if we give a live vaccine afterwards, that abrogates the negative effects. So in summary, what these findings have shown us is that we cannot assume that we know the full effect of a vaccine on overall health if we know the protective effect against the vaccine disease. It's simply not the same. We have written a very thorough review about that in Lancet Infectious Diseases in 2020, if anybody is interested. I just want to mention that this has been kind of controversial for a while, but has become more and more acknowledged. And in 2020, the discovery of non-specific effects was actually made a milestone on the journal's Nature's milestones in vaccines. And there is increasing acknowledgement in general that health interventions cannot only be assessed based on their effect against the targeted disease or condition. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to mention a very special book by Vinay Prasad and Adam Sifu called Ending Medical Reversals, where they discuss the fact that we need to test the effect of our health interventions more thoroughly, and we needed to test them on the outcomes that matter. And in this book, they estimate that around 40% of what we consider state-of-the-art health interventions actually turn out to be either unhelpful or, even worse, actually harmful. And their proposal, which I think is correct, is that the human body is so complicated, and our understanding is so superficial, so we can actually be really wrong about what we believe a health intervention does and what it actually does in real life. And they put forward other examples like cancer screening programs, like operating knees and backs for disc and menisc problems, and also putting in stents in some heart conditions, all of which seems completely biologically sensible, but in fact turns out not to have the effect and make a difference for the outcome that matters, namely the health or survival of patients. So really their proposal is very much in line with what I'm saying here. We cannot just assume that we understand the full effect of our health interventions without testing them, and without testing them on the outcome that we are interested in, not some surrogate marker. This is the key message. I'm going to repeat it once more in this presentation, but really we cannot assume we know the full effect. It's necessary to test the assumption in properly conducted studies of the outcomes that matters. So let's move on to Copit19 interventions and discuss some examples of interventions that have been used during the pandemic: the vaccines, the face masks, the school closures, and mass testing, isolation, and contact tracing. These interventions were not tested in properly conducted studies and or the outcome, they were not tested against the outcome that matters. So health authorities basically went on and assumed that they would be beneficial because they assumed that they would reduce the risk of COVID-19. But the problem and the challenges to us is that we really don't know for all these interventions that they reduce the risk of severe COVID-19. We do know it now for the vaccines, but for the rest, we really don't know it. And we also don't know if these interventions are beneficial for the outcomes that matter, overall health. So we may know for vaccines that they reduce the risk of severe COVID-19, but they haven't actually been tested for whether they reduce overall mortality and morbidity. I've written an article, it's in Danish, it's on my LinkedIn profile, but Google Translate does a nice job. But here I'll just give you the summary of this article, which is called How to Ensure Safe COVID-19 Vaccines. And this was written before the vaccines were actually there, but it was discussing our current system for testing vaccines against how it should ideally be, in my point of view, if it was to test for non-specific effects of vaccines. So in the current phase 3 trials, I hope you can see my arrow here. I'm not sure, probably you cannot, but in the left side or the middle column, you have what we're doing in the current phase 3 trials and the current post-marketing surveillance for vaccine testing. And you can see that it's all focused on COVID-19. But if you know that vaccines have non-specific effects, this is not good enough. So I've written in the right column what is the ideal studies that should be done to also take into account non-specific effects. And that means that the ideal phase 3 trial should be conducted so that they measure all symptoms, not just COVID-19 and plausible side effects during the full duration of the study. They should also focus on overall mortality and morbidity, and the follow-up should be of a certain duration. Because if vaccines affect the immune system's ability to combat other infections, that wouldn't show up in just a few weeks. And post-marketing, once the vaccines are approved, there's also a need for further testing. In my opinion, vaccines should be rolled out in a randomized way. That might not have been very feasible right in the beginning of the pandemic when we were all eager to have the vaccines rolled out to those who needed it most. But at least it could have been taken into account that the vaccines could not be given to everybody on the very same date. So we could have introduced them in a step-wedged rollout that would allow for a better assessment and comparison of vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And we could have done more active follow-up of participants, not just passively through registration and reporting of side effects. And of course, the outcome that matters is overall mortality and morbidity, all-cause consultations, hospitalizations, and death. So this is the way I think the COVID-19 vaccine should have been tested. And the reason I do that is that would allow us to answer some serious questions and concerns about the vaccines. So if we move on to the next slide. We know now that there are people who claim that there is an increase in all-cause mortality, which coincide with the introduction of the COVID-19 vaccines. Here's the curve of overall mortality in Denmark, and there has been a kind of concerning increase in all-cause mortality from around the spring of 2021, when the vaccine started to be rolled out. And we know that there are many reasons why this increase may occur. It could be that there have been delayed diagnosing of cardiovascular death or of cancers. It could be that our immune system has been weakened by the lack of exposure to pathogens. So many countries experience this surge in RSV infections in the early autumn, very unusual. So there are many reasons why this increase in overall mortality could occur. But the problem is we cannot exclude that it might be related to the vaccines. If we move on to the next slide, we have data from the UK in the next picture here, where they actually divided deaths between 10 and 59 years of age by vaccine status, and there was an increased mortality among the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. This could be related to age confounding. So again, it's not a proof that vaccines have anything to do with that, but we don't have good data to say that they don't have anything to do with that. If we move on to the next slide, it's from Scotland. And here they've actually tried to take into account the age confounding, and they have in the green curve the eldest people, then the slightly younger in the blue, the slightly younger in the yellow, the slightly younger again in the gray. And what they claim here with this curve is that mortality starts to increase in each of these age groups at the time where the vaccines are introduced in this age group. So all of these curves are here. If you take the next slide, they are here as elephants in the room, because we cannot say that the vaccines cause the increase in mortality, but we really do not have the data to document that the vaccines don't cause increases in overall mortality. We don't have the data to document that, yes, you will be overall healthier from taking a COVID-19 vaccine. So this is exposing a big lack in our documentation of the health interventions, in this case vaccines, that are being used in the COVID-19 pandemic. Because the things I proposed for COVID-19 vaccines here in the red box, the randomized trials, the different designs that could be used, like step-wedged rollout to monitor effects, and the focus on overall health, that's not unique to vaccines. Next slide, please. I think we could have used the same approaches studying many of the other health interventions that we used during the pandemic. And let's take the example of face masks. It would have been absolutely feasible to do cluster randomized trials where we could have randomized units, that could be schools, that could be municipalities, that could be regions, to different recommendations or health policies. For instance, one proposal I would have was to test mandatory versus voluntary masking. I think a lot of people got very upset with the mandatory masking, or not a lot of people, but a group of people got very upset about it. They didn't believe that masks work. They weren't enthusiastic about using the masks. And they probably, if they were like my son, for instance, they would just take their same old face mask, put it into the pocket, put it up again when they were to use it, and they would feel very strongly that this was something they didn't like to do. And I'm in doubt whether it actually really had any effect. If masks have an effect, would it have an effect in a person who really isn't motivated to use it? So maybe a cluster randomized trial would have revealed that it didn't add any value to have mandatory masking versus voluntary masking. And we could have avoided having mandatory masking, which is creating a lot of anger. We could also have tested masking in primary schools versus no masking in primary schools in the same way, with the outcomes that could matter, which would, for instance, be percentage of COVID-19 positives, the percentage of COVID-19 and all-cause hospitalizations, etc. We are doing a cluster randomized trial. Next slide, please. In Guinea-Bissau, where we have taken various clusters in our study area, and we've randomized them to receive or not receive cloth masks. So we had in the pandemic a big cloth mask production, and we handed out cloth masks to half of the clusters and not to the other clusters. And currently, as I speak, we are analyzing the data to try to provide some evidence for whether delivering cloth masks during the midst of a pandemic in an African country would actually have any effect on overall mortality and morbidity in the cluster, not only in the person who is wearing the mask. We could also have tested the effect of school closures in randomized trials. So we could have randomized, again, units, schools, municipalities, or regions to different recommendations. For instance, we could have had school closures or no school closures, or we could also test whether sending pupils home in isolation after contact with a positive case versus staying in school with daily rapid testing would lead to increases in percentage of, again, COVID-19 positives or COVID-19 hospitalizations or all-cause hospitalizations. This kind of trial was actually conducted, next slide please, in the UK, where they did a study to see if daily testing could maintain children in school rather than sending them home. So what you have here is on the right-hand side graphs which show the two upper graphs, the incidence of COVID-19 and the absence from school of school pupils, and in the two lower graphs, the incidence of COVID-19 and absence from school in the school's teachers and staff. And you can see what I've also written on the left-hand side, that the conclusions of this cluster randomized trial was that you could, in the secondary schools, you had the same incidence of COVID-19, whether you let people be in the school or the pupils be in the school if they tested positive. So what one can see here is that in the intervention areas and the control areas, there were almost the same incidence of COVID-19. But what you can see with the higher blue bars is that the absence from school was much higher in the areas where they didn't use the rapid testing, but sent pupils home if they were positive. So this policy of keeping schools open with rapid test didn't increase the incidence of COVID-19, but it did increase the time that the pupils were able to spend in school. So I think this goes a long way to document how these cluster randomized trials can provide the kind of evidence that we really need to guide us in the pandemic. So with regard to mass testing and isolation and contact tracing, again, we haven't had evidence for anything we have done, but we could have obtained this kind of evidence during the pandemic if we had done these cluster randomized trials. For instance, focusing on the effect of having a more age-focused approach with testing in the elderly and vulnerable people versus the incidence-focused. That in case of Denmark, where I'm from, we have, in my opinion, done pretty badly by focusing on the young people because we focused on the incidence of COVID-19. So the testing was primarily carried out in the young people rather in the elderly, where actually the testing matters most. Another proposal I've had during the pandemic was to use the PCR-CT value to guide isolation and contact tracing. This is really based on the fact that we know that the PCR test, it's not only positive or negative, it also comes with a CT value, which is indicative of the viral load. So the higher the CT value, the lower the viral load in the throat of the person who was tested. And you can see here that there's an almost linear correlation. So the lower the CT value, the lower the risk of infecting somebody in the household. So what this data suggests is that if we had taken the people who had high CT values and said, you don't need to isolate and you don't need to do any contact tracing, that might have had a very limited impact on the pandemic, but obviously it would have been of great value for the people who were tested positive with a high CT value. So really this could have been solved with cluster randomized trials where we had tested these two policies across from each other to see what was the effect on the COVID-19 and overall hospitalization incidence, for instance. Again, with the purpose of lessening some of the very harsh restrictions. So obviously coming with these suggestions that we could test the effect of COVID-19 intervention has been met with some resistance and some arguments. And the arguments I've heard mostly are first that we cannot test the interventions because that signalizes to the population that there's insecurity about the effect of the interventions. But to be honest, I think most citizens realize that there is very limited documentation for most of the interventions. So I don't think it will come as a big shock for them if authorities admitted that we need to test it because we want to be sure that we are having the best policies. We want to be sure that we are not putting restrictions on you that are not necessary. We want to make sure that we are using taxpayer money at the best possible way to guarantee the best possible health in our population. The other argument I hear against testing the effect of COVID-19 interventions is fairness, and that is that people would be maybe upset if in some instances their school would be the one where they should contact or they should rapid test, or their school would be the one where they were closed, etc. But I think if it was a general rule that health authorities were testing interventions over time, these things would be randomly distributed. Sometimes you would be in the strata in the allocation group that you would be happy about. Other times you would be in the allocation group you wouldn't be happy about. But in a long life, that would kind of even out. So I don't think that's a really good argument not to test if there's an indication to test. Clearly, what I see as a big advantage is that if we were testing our health interventions, we would have answers to some of the many questions that are still out there. we still don't have any good proof that face mask protects against COVID-19. We still don't know whether school closures could lead to important reductions in COVID-19. We still don't know if mass testing and contact tracing and isolation are really worth the massive costs, both economically and in terms of mental health and other aspects for the citizens. And we don't know if vaccines are the super weapon. Yes, perhaps against severe COVID-19, but does that make it a super weapon if it's given to young people? And are we sure that they actually have the intended effect on overall health in all the people who receive them? One thing is that I focus quite a lot on COVID-19 here, and that has obviously been the main outcome of interest during the pandemic. But I also want to put a big question mark for all age groups, whether we are sure that the effect against COVID-19 is always proportional to an effect on overall health. So that's one question mark that is still out there as well. I think what we still seem to have not taken into account, what health authorities and politicians still don't take into account under the pandemic, has been that we cannot assume we know the full health effect of an intervention. We have a very superficial knowledge of the interventions we do and a superficial understanding of the complex systems that they affect. And therefore, we need to test our assumptions. And we need to test them in properly conducted studies on the outcomes that matters. If that becomes a lesson learned from the pandemic, I think it might be a very important lesson for public health, not only during pandemics, but also overall. And that may, in fact, negate some of the negative impact of the pandemic. So we have not learned it yet, but it might not be too late, and we might have a lot to gain from it. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm still here for a few minutes more if you want to ask some questions.
Christine, thank you so much for your nice presentation, and we have a few questions for you.
Indeed, dear Professor, thank you very much for this deep insight into the paradigm of vaccination. However, I would like to ask you one specific question towards the necessity of children vaccination. And what is the Danish authorities, medical authorities think, and what is your personal opinion? Because it's a fact well reported that mortality rates from COVID are manifold lower than from the seasonal flu. I assume there is not a single child dead from COVID in Denmark, as well as Lithuania and other Nordic and Baltic countries, as compared, for instance, for virus N1H1 infection of 1897, where mortality rates of children were significantly higher. Our medical authorities in Lithuania are relentlessly, I should say obsessively, pushing every single parent to give a jab to their child. What do you think about that, provided that mortality rates are exceptionally low?
My government has, in Denmark, decided to recommend vaccination of 5 to 11-year-old children. I have been arguing against this decision because I don't think it's justified to give a new vaccine to children who have very little to gain from vaccination, for exactly the reasons that you are pointing forward here. So any potential harm from vaccinations would be unacceptable given the very low benefit. So I've looked towards Norway, where they have a very reasonable COVID-19 vaccination policy in children and young people. And I can recommend their very thorough documentation of the need for vaccination in children.
Dear Professor Christine, can I ask one more question? Let's imagine that you are involved in regulation of clinical trials, and you have a protocol of clinical trials submitted for you for adoption for COVID vaccine. What endpoints would you require?
I acknowledge that in phase 3 trials, we might not have overall mortality as a main outcome, because that would make trials extremely large. But I think there's no excuse not to collect data on overall health. As it is now, the system is not geared to test the effect of, so as it is now, the system is not geared to test the effect, the non-specific effects of vaccines. So a pneumonia, for instance, occurring 2 months after vaccination in a clinical trial would never be assessed as a potential consequence of the vaccination. But what we know now about non-specific effects is that it could very well be an effect of the vaccine. So therefore, clinical trials should be capturing all symptoms, and the evaluation of their overall effect and their safety should be based on all symptoms and not just the vaccine disease and plausible adverse events in the first couple of weeks.
Thank you, Christine, so much for your nice presentation and for your full answers. Have a nice day.
You too. Have a nice conference.
Thank you. Keičiamės, ne?